So welcome to today's webinar called Making Maps Shine with ArcGIS Online. My name is Shane Bradt. I work at UNH Cooperative Extension. And I'm offering this webinar on behalf of UNH Cooperative Extension, but also on behalf of the Extension Map Assist, which is a group of geospatial technology specialists working in Cooperative Extension, and also this new Mapping Innovation Hub, which people will be hearing more about over the coming year. So the idea behind this webinar is that it's one of 4 webinars in a series about how people can use mapping to engage audiences and to tell their story. So the first one of these webinars was on January 19th, and that webinar's recording is up and available. This is the second one, which is focusing on how do you use ArcGIS Online and some of the tricks that you can use to share and create maps. You see we have a couple coming up, focusing on how do you tell your story with maps, specifically using story maps on your computer, and then a fourth on how to create a photo-based map in the Snap, creating story maps on your phone. Now we see these to be sequential, so if you don't know a lot about why you might want to use maps, it could be useful to look at that first webinar, the recording, and I hope that more webinars will be offered, either slightly different versions of these or especially looking at things that people wanted to know more about that we didn't cover in the webinars that we already have scheduled. There's a post on the Extension website that has this information, including the links at the bottom, and you can see bit.ly/webmap2016 will bring you to that page. So in the first webinar, we talked about different types of online mapping, but in this webinar, we're focusing on ArcGIS Online specifically. So what is ArcGIS Online? ArcGIS Online, according to Esri here, is a complete cloud-based mapping platform. So when we compare different types of mapping platforms, one of the things that made ArcGIS Online stand out was that not only could you make maps using lots of different types of data, but there were plenty of ways to hook into other people's data that were posted online, and there were lots of ways to control the way your data were displayed, and also ways to share your maps and create sort of work products based on your initial map that you created. Now, on Esri's website, sometimes it's a bit hard to tell the difference between what they're talking about for online versus desktop. As you can see, that really, if you go to arcgis.com, it brings you to ArcGIS Online. So keep in mind that if you have ArcGIS Online, you can use it alone. You don't necessarily have to have anything else. But if you do have some of Esri's other products, such as ArcGIS for desktop and even ArcGIS for server, there's a lot more that you can do. And if you go to their page, you can go ahead and there's a lot of information explaining what they think ArcGIS Online is good for, how it works, and also the different features that are part of ArcGIS Online. Now, if the first time you've ever been to ArcGIS Online and you'd like to try out making some maps, what they'd like you to do is click on this Try ArcGIS button. I suggest that you don't necessarily do that, but instead click on this Sign In up here on the right, and you'll be brought to a page that looks like this. So when you are going to use ArcGIS Online for the first time, there are a couple of different options that you have. First is to click on the button that they want you to click on, which is Try ArcGIS up here, which allows you to get a 60-day free trial of something called an organizational account. Now, if you want to try that, you can for 60 days, and they'll give you access to all of the features. After those 60 days are up, then the account will lock. And the only way to unlock it, of course, is to pay or get whatever account subscription that they want you to get or that you qualify for. Now, if you want to try and make different maps and everything I'm doing today, you can use this other type of account. It's called a public account. So when you sign up for that, if you already have an Esri account, you're automatically given one. But if not, anybody can sign up for a public account. And in fact, even if you are going to get an organizational account, it's not a bad idea to have a public account as well. So that is free. There's no cost. There are limitations to it, but a lot of the limitations have nothing to do with what we're talking about today, which is making maps and sharing maps. There's a lot of information, although some of it can be hard to find, with the differences between an organizational account and a public account. But just very briefly, the three that I think are the most important is number one, privacy. So your ability to control data and give people access to only certain pockets of data, and control sort of groups of people working together and what they have access to is much higher with an organizational account than it is with a public account. Also, if you're interested in doing any sort of geospatial analyses, there's an analysis capability that ArcGIS Online has when you have an organizational account, and you cannot do any analysis with the public account. And often one of the things that people are the most interested in when they're talking about using some sort of cloud system for mapping is to be able to collect data in the field and have it automatically synchronized with a map that they have online. And if you want to do that, you have to use an organizational account. There are ways that you can use mobile mapping on your mobile devices. It will work with the paid account and will not work with the public account. So there's lots more details involved, but those are the three basic things. We'll come back to the end to talk a little bit more about the differences between these. But regardless of which one of these you have, you can do all of the mapping that we're going to be talking about today. So there's lots and lots of different things that we could do with ArcGIS Online, and I think what I've tried to do and what I'm going to show you today is give you some basics of different ways you can add data, different ways you can display and share data. I'm sure that there are lots more that we could do, and one of the things, of course, I'm looking for in the questions and also the evaluation at the end is what other things I could show in future webinars, either those that are already scheduled or webinars that we could schedule in the future. Are there any questions before I go on to sort of demonstrating different ways to make maps and share maps with ArcGIS Online? Okay, so whether you have a paid account or a free account, when you log into ArcGIS Online or when you get to arcgis.com, go ahead and click here on Sign In and enter your credentials. So as you can see, I have a variety of different accounts that I use, but for this one, I'm going to use this account. So the first thing a lot of people would like to do is be able to make a map. You can just go ahead and click up here on this map button. Notice that this top bar exists for the most part up here, depending on what page you're on. Although as soon as you click on the map button, that menu then moves from the top here down to the side. So when you first get into ArcGIS Online, if you're not signed in, you can make a map. But in order to save or really work with the map to a great extent, you need to have an account and sign in. So a couple of different things you can do. Number one, easily you can change the base map. There's a variety of different types of base maps, including imagery that changes depending on where you are in the country. They have things like the National Geographic styled map, the national map, a lot of different options that you have. For now, we're just going to start with this topographic map. Now, there's a lot of different ways to add data. We're just going to cover three of the most common ways. And one of the things that makes ArcGIS Online different than other types of web maps programs is that there's plenty of layers that other people have already submitted that you can search for and add to your map. And this is also one of the powerful things. If you create maps and you add your own data layers, you too can make your maps available for people to look at to add to their own maps. So, for example, if I live in New Hampshire, I'm going to search for the New Hampshire GIS database, which is New Hampshire Granite. And there's a couple of different data layers that pop up here that are available by New Hampshire Granite. And one of the things you're going to notice, of course, when you work in this wonderful, Web 2.0 or 3.0, whatever we're at, is that anybody can post data. Now, this is both a good thing and it can be a scary thing. Notice there's lots of different data layers here, including some that are from Granite, but also by this R. Woolner and Framid W. Demops. So before you use data, while it's good that you can find a lot of data people have posted, it's important to think about where are these data coming from and should I use them? One of the cool things about ArcGIS Online is that you can click on any of these data layers and you'll get a little pop-up that will have some information. And if you click item details here, it'll bring you to a page where there's more information available. So you can see a description, use constraints, who actually published it. Sometimes there's very little data here, sometimes there's lots of data, showing you in this metadata format who produced the data and where are these data coming from. So in a way, unlike a lot of other mapping platforms that are online, you can find pretty easily who produced the data and maybe have a way to evaluate whether or not you should use it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just bring on some base layers. So these data are provided by the State of New Hampshire GIS Clearinghouse, and you can see that it brought it onto the map. I'll click on adding layers here. And there's two different ways to view things. One in this content panel, which shows you a list of the data layers, but if you click on legend, that gives you the information about what each of these symbological types mean. So somebody at the New Hampshire database created these. They allow you to zoom in and zoom out. You can see, of course, as you zoom in, there might be different data that are available at different scales. This is maybe not the most dramatic example of data layers you can add, but it shows you that you don't necessarily have to add all the data yourself. There are people who have posted data that you can use and add to your map simply by searching for it. Now, another type of data that may be useful would look at could be, for example, conservation and public lands in New Hampshire. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. Zoom back out. So this is the data layer coming straight from the New Hampshire GIS Clearinghouse that has public lands and conservation lands. So again, you didn't have to get this. All you had to do is search for it. One of the other differences with ArcGIS Online is it allows you to act on GIS data in a GIS way by filtering, displaying things using different types of what they're called attribute data, or data about the conservation lands. So for example, if we wanted to show differences in conservation lands, instead of showing just the solid, for example, we might want to show primary protection type, for example, which would give us the ability to recolor all of the conservation parcels based on the type of protection they're given. And if you say, well, what is the type of protection? Remember, you can click on the legend button, and it shows you fee ownership, conservation easement, scenic easement, and so on. So these are all part of the GIS database that the State Clearinghouse is putting out there for you to use. Now, if you have desktop GIS, you're used to this. But if you don't, here's a quick and easy way that you can use GIS data in a GIS fashion. Now, you may be saying to yourself, wow, this is a really ugly looking map. I have some yellow polygons, and on top of there's this green in the background, and the colors don't really work well together. Now, you do have the ability to change them one at a time if you'd like, depending on how the data layers have been set up by the people providing them. But one of the things that I really like, sort of had done this myself in GIS, but they now provide this, is something called the dark gray and light gray canvas map option. A lot of people really like topographic maps or aerial images in the background. Part of the problem with that is that it becomes very difficult to see the data sometimes. So one of the options you have is to use something called light gray canvas. So what this does is it has a light gray map. Of course, there's also the option for dark gray canvas, which gives you some basic features that you can use to give context to your data. And as you zoom in on your data, those features become more complex and more information is revealed. So often with mapping, the total amount of information you're trying to display is not as important as making sure that the information you're trying to display is visible. And instead of having a whole bunch of layers with lots of color, sometimes it's very nice to have a subtle background that you can use to display your data against. Okay, so let's take a quick look. If there's any questions that people have so far about what I've shown. Okay, so let's pretend for the moment that this is the map that you want to make, where you would like a map showing all the conservation and public lands in the state of New Hampshire by primary protection type. You want them colored by that type, and you want to have some sort of background layer of roads, streets, to provide some context. So if that's the case and you're happy enough with these colors, you're done and you can start to share your map with people. Now, most of these online mapping services work the same to this extent, that there are a couple of different basic ways you can share your map. So the first way, and to do any of this, you have to save your map, which is one of the reasons that you need an account. Demo. And of course, the tags that you use will be based on whatever it is that you would like to be able to sort your own data by. So it could be that land conservation is something important. It could be that roads are something important. You're going to have to decide what it is that you would like to put on there. And when you're done, you can click Save Map. So what this has done is it saved it in your account. Any computer or mobile device you log into, you should be able to see those maps. Question: is there a way to see or calculate the percentage of each type? For example, how much of New Hampshire is under fee ownership? So the answer to that is yes, it depends, but potentially. So it depends on how the data are set up and how the data are provided. Often data are provided from clearinghouses as image tiles instead of real actual data. So it's possible that you may be able to, but a lot of times it's not feasible with the way the data are provided. If they were provided in a format that would let you access the actual data, you might be able to do some calculations using an organizational account. So I don't know, I'm not as familiar with Granite's setup, and maybe the analysis capabilities will be something that we could focus on in a future webinar, while I make sure that we have data and investigate a little bit of the types of data that are available, for example, in New Hampshire, and whether or not they could be analyzed. So sometimes you can, but it also would require you to have an organizational account. Any other quick questions? I'll proceed for the moment. So one of the things that you get when you have a map saved is you can share it in a variety of ways. So once you make the map public so that people could see it, you have several different options that we're going to talk about. First, you can send a link to that map. So that's a short link that you could email to someone, and when you clicked on it, they would bring them directly to this map. You have a built-in way here, of course, to share it on Facebook and share it on Twitter. And the other relatively simple thing you can do is you can embed your map in a website. So it provides you the option to set the size of your map, allow responsive sizing, which means if people change the size of the browser, or if they were using it on a mobile device, for example, that it would shift that size. And you have a lot of abilities to choose the map options. So do you have zoom control? Do you have a home button? Do you let people choose the base map? Can you have them click to view a larger map and come here? All of these options and the types of themes you can go ahead and set here in this little dialog box. And then right here, this area, you can copy and paste. So if you know enough about HTML and you have access to your website HTML, you can copy and paste that in. If you don't know enough about it, you have to send that to somebody, whoever has access to it, and they can go ahead and they are able, hopefully, to put that in place. The good thing about it is once you've created this embedded website situation, you don't have to re-embed the map to update it. So once that map is embedded in a website, it's basically poking a hole in the page. It's whatever size you told it to be, displaying the controls on top of it. And as you update your map on ArcGIS Online, it will automatically update the map in that website. So you do this once and continue to build your map. As long as you save whatever you're doing, the map will be updated in the website itself. So it's nice if you don't access to your website HTML, you don't have to keep doing this over and over and over again. Once you have it set up, you can just work on the map in ArcGIS Online and have the map current on your website. So this is a relatively simple way to create a map. You search for data online that already exists, and you can share it by either tweeting it, Facebooking it, sending somebody a link, or by embedding it in a web page. Now, what if you have your own data? What if you have some data on your computer? For example, what if you had rainfall data? Could you add that data into a map, and could you do anything with it? So let me go ahead and create a new map. And instead of searching for layers, we're going to add a layer from our computer. And this is just a quick example of precipitation data that shows rainfall in a given period of time in the state of New Hampshire. So this file, by the way, is a CSV file. And you can see here that you can have a CSV or a text file that has comma or semicolon tab delimited, or a GPX file, which is something that any GPS unit can save and any software connecting to a GPS unit can save. And you can also see a zipped shape file, which we'll talk about in a bit. So notice also that there's a maximum number of features, 1,000 features that you can use. And also when you're talking about addresses, 250 features. So you can't put oodles and noodles of data on here, but you can put hundreds of data points on here using this approach. So if I click on Import Layer, that's looked at my CSV file. And for the second, let's just click Done. Okay, go back to there. And it's dropped it on the map, and it automatically did some formatting to it. So if you're used to normal GIS formatting, this might be could be a bit tricky. In some ways, it's good because it really helps you, and in other ways, if you're used to GIS, sometimes you want it to get out of your way and let you configure it. But you can notice here that it's automatically started to take those points, and instead of turning them into points, which most web maps will do, it's now started to look at the attribute data. It's looking at rainfall amounts, and it's starting to build a map that shows information. Not just the point locations, but taking the map data, the attribute underlying database, and starting to create a map. So there's different ways that you can do it here, and these are the types of things that are changing all the time. So you have just the location if you only wanted to show the location. If you wanted to show differences based on some sort of rainfall amount, for example, you could show that. But probably more interesting are things, these top three, which are count and amount. So for example, if you wanted to have these different sizes based on the precipitation, you could click on count and amounts. And if you choose the option of that, you can control the size of the bubbles. You can control the transparency range. If you don't like orange for some reason, you can choose a different color. Orange is fine with me. You can also change the size. If you think that the bubbles are too large, there's a lot of different ways that you can control the way that these data look. Interestingly, you can also choose the visibility range. So for example, if you don't want to see the rainfall this far out, you can move this visibility slider over here so that those data will only appear when you get in a little bit closer and will disappear when you are farther out. So if you haven't constructed any online maps, we're used to having to worry about this, but people who work at Google and people who work at Esri and people who work at MapQuest, for example, are very used to thinking about when data should be visible and the scales at which making it visible just becomes confusing. So this is nice to be able to control it, and it's a pretty easy way to do it. Interestingly, they have this this approach called a heat map, which in some ways is a little bit analytical, only generally. And it allows you to, instead of just showing each point, it sort of interpolates between the different points to show areas of emphasis based on those rainfall patterns. And as you can see, you can control the different color patterns here. You can also choose the area of influence. You have the ability to take those points and using the rainfall amounts, produced a stylized map showing perhaps the area of emphasis or more information than just the points alone. So this may or may not be what you're looking to show. You may prefer just to show, for example, the locations, but this is taking the data and the location and applying some sort of small analysis to it. So if this is the, let's say this is the final version of your map that you'd like to share with people, you could go ahead and save this map, and we'll call it Demo of Rainfall. And you could go ahead and share this the same way that you've shared the map that we just saw, by having it embedded in a website or creating a web app. But one of the things that's really interesting that ArcGIS Online allows you to do is it allows you to create a presentation. So up here you can see there's this button that says Create Presentation. And once you click on that, you enter a different mode of the map. So this allows you to create a presentation as if you were doing a slide presentation, but instead of using slides, you're using the live map and map data. So all you have to do to start building your presentation is click Add, and the title will be, This is the Rainfall of New Hampshire. In the location, I wanted to show the whole state. Now you can have, if you have different layers, you can turn layers on and off on each slide, and you can have different base maps. So for this one, let's just do this dark gray canvas, for example. I'm going to click Save. So if I want to add another slide, I click Add. It's created a second slide, and I'll say, for example, it was a dry week in the north. And I can go ahead and zoom up to northern New Hampshire. And perhaps I'll go to the imagery, or let's say the imagery with labels. And then I'm going to click Set to Current. That's my second slide. And then if I add a third slide, I could say, ... but in the seacoast area, there was rain aplenty. And go ahead and zoom back out, zoom down to the seacoast. Area, let's do that. And maybe I'll do the oceans layer and click Set to Current. And then I'll add one more slide and say the worst rain was in the central region. And go ahead and zoom here. Of course, you can see the interpolation changing as you go, so I might want to zoom out a little bit further and click Set to Current and save. So when I'm done, I click on Slide List, and I can see that I have 4 different slides that I've created. I can change the order, I can hide them or make them visible, but if I wanted to then present this to people, I could go ahead and click on Play. And this launches it into presentation mode. Now you can see here that this is the first slide that I have. This is the rainfall of New Hampshire. I can navigate through the slides by this drop-down list, or I can simply click to the right to advance to each slide, one slide at a time. You can also have this set up so that the slides advance automatically at a certain set time interval. And you can also have it set up that if you play it and the slides advance automatically, when they get down to the end, they wait 10 seconds and then start at the beginning again. And of course, keep in mind that even though you've created a quote-unquote slide, at any point in the presentation, you can move the map around, you can zoom in, zoom out. Of course, if you created a presentation and then the map data were updated, the next time you gave the presentation, you'd see the new data on the map. So this is a very good, of course, it requires internet connection, but it's a very nice, interesting way of presenting your map, presenting the data, even letting people step through your map, showing the parts you would like to show. And if you create it where it does the automatic restart, it can be something that you could have on a display or just running and having people watch it without having to do anything other than creating this presentation, getting it up, and starting it to run. So are there any questions on presentations? How it works, what the point of it is? Okay, question. Could you change the data representation based on the slide? For example, going from heat map on one slide to points in another. You could if you had the data in multiple times. So if you had, one of the things that you can do in the presentation, and I only have one layer here, but let's try this, see if I can bring it in again, see what happens. Done. So what I've done basically is I brought it in again. I could have copied also and pasted it in here, but now I have two versions of this data layer in here. Both versions are visible at the same time. So what you could do in your presentation, notice for, oops, let me save first. Save it and go back to your presentation. What you can do in each of these slides, on this slide list, to edit the slides, you click on this little pencil. You could choose which one of these is being displayed. So in that way, and let me just click, we'll save it here. You could have it moving back and forth between different ways of displaying the data simply by having that data in your map more than once and then choosing for each slide which one of those you displayed. So yes, you could do it. Any other questions? Okay, so, and just so you know, there can only be one presentation per map. So really think of it as your alternate version of your map. You can only have one for each map. So if we click new map one more time, I'm going to go here and show a final way of adding data to the map. Now, some people will have GIS data layers themselves, and often what I find in towns or folks that had somebody that used to know GIS and currently they have nobody who knows GIS, they don't know what to do with their shape files, how to display them, or they'll even download some data from a clearinghouse like New Hampshire Granite and not be sure how to display it. So if you have a shape file, which is a common GIS file format, and then the shape file is zipped together, and at least when you download things from New Hampshire Granite, it comes in that format, you can add that straight to the map here in ArcGIS Online. Or if you've created your own shape file in something like ArcGIS for desktop or any of the open source GIS software packages, you could also zip it up and potentially show it here on the map. The one big caveat is there's only so many features you can show, so you'll have to see, for example, if you have tax parcels for the county, you're not going to be able to put that in the map. It won't let you do that. But to show you a quick example of that, we're going to go ahead and add a layer from a file again. And I have two different layers that I grabbed from New Hampshire Granite. One, 2 different years of eelgrass data from Great Bay, which is the estuarine area near the university. And you see, as soon as you bring in the shape file, it went ahead, grabbed all the information, noticed it was inside of a zipped file that had all of the relevant data in there. And for this one, I'm just going to choose, I just want to show location and just a single symbol. So I just want to show this, but with no outline at all. So no color for the outline, so they all blend together. And this, to me, is another great case where a different colored background map might be even more useful. So I'm going to use that dark gray background map. So as you zoom into Great Bay, you can see this is a shape file I just grabbed from a website and put it up here, and it shows you the different extent of eelgrass in 2001. And I'm going to go ahead and add the same thing, same layer type, but from 2011. I'm going to do that same thing to change, show location only, because I'm not really interested, in this case, I'm not interested in the attributes, I'm just interested in the actual location of the eelgrass. And I'm going to click OK. So here what we have now is a shapefile, 2 shapefiles that we got from New Hampshire Granite. And we can now look and see what the difference in those coverages are. So here's, for example, in 2011 where the eelgrass was in Great Bay, and in 2001 where it was in Great Bay. And again, to me, having a base map with less detail in it sometimes lets you see more of the data. This is very interesting because you could look and compare it to the land itself and maybe look for patterns in land use. To me, this dark gray really allows the context to be there, but the data to speak to you. So again, there's a limit with how much data you can get in for shapefiles, but you can do it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this as well, and we'll save this as eelgrass demo. And in this time, instead of just sharing it or giving a presentation, we're going to show you something, to me, which is one of the most exciting things, is creating a web app. So we could spend an entire webinar just talking about web apps and probably several webinars, but just to give you an idea, once you have this basic map, you could tweet it, as we said, put it on Facebook, embed it, you could send a link, you could create a presentation you could send to someone, or you can create something called a web app. So as you can see here, there's lots and lots of different options that you could use for creating a web app. The idea behind web apps are that they are slick, interactive versions of web pages, so it takes over the whole web page, and it uses your ArcGIS Online map as the beginning, but the people who use it don't have to know anything about ArcGIS Online, they don't have to have an account, and they don't see the same interface that you're seeing while you're building the map. So one, that you can see that there's lots of different types, and some of these require quite a bit of setup, but I'm just going to use this one called the Map Tools. And you click, if you're interested in this, you can go ahead on your own ArcGIS Online account. You can click on each web app. It gives you a brief description. You can preview it, so I can give you a little demonstration of what it would look like if you put your map out there using this web app. You can download it if you want to. You do not have to download it, but this is something if you're running your own web server that you'd like to host it on and you would like to do some coding, you can do that. But all of these things inside of ArcGIS Online, if you just create the app in here, there's really no coding you have to do. It's just all with different clicks. So here's my web app. Just enter the summary. Done. And then the result is something that looks like this. So you can see instead of coding, you can go ahead and choose a whole bunch of different options, whether you want the map title or not, what the title size is, if you want a logo in the header. You have lots of different options, but again, not having to know anything about coding. And when I'm done, you can click Save, and then Done. And you've created a map that looks like this. Now, this may not be that dramatic, but if you think about it, this is pretty different than just using the web map itself. This web app you can send to people. They don't have to have ArcGIS Online. You've controlled what it looks like, or you have more control. It takes over the whole page. And this one's one of the most simple. You allow people, if you want to change to different background maps, for example. You can also control the layers where you have one on or the other. So you do give people a decent amount of control, This is a simple map, but if you have more complex data and you spend more time, you can have a broader range of options. There's even some of these which have a print dialog box built into them. It gives you a lot of control. And in some ways, I think from an outreach or education perspective, these are much more useful than ArcGIS web maps, because you don't necessarily want your users to have to know how to use ArcGIS Online in order to share information, or view information. So you could be behind the scenes, or various people creating your web map and then distributing it through this web app that lets people view your data without knowing anything about ArcGIS Online. As I said, there are lots of different options for web apps that are out there. Again, we could do a whole webinar just on this, but that gives you a brief idea of the types of web apps. Anybody have any questions on those before I do just a little final piece of information here? The last thing I'll say is that a type of web app, which is really interesting, is something called a story map. And our next two webinars focus on story maps specifically. And story maps were something that were created with the idea of creating a dynamic way to display information and to lead people through exploring maps. I mean, part of the problem with maps, which is not everybody knows what to do with a map. If you're a map type person or a GIS person, you'll probably zoom in and out, look at different features. Other people may not. So the idea of having a story map is it lets you create and configure the map in such a way, again, using very little to no coding, that allows you to tell your story, to present information. Now, just briefly, a couple examples of web story maps. I have just 2 or 3 quick examples. One is this exact same example that we just saw with Great Bay eelgrass, but instead of having both of the layers being shown on the same map using a web app that you can turn them on and off, this story map is something called the swipe story map, and it allows you to put 2 different maps, one on each side of the page. And let's just look here, for example, at one of the parts of Great Bay that has the most eelgrass in it. And it creates a swipe tool that lets you drag back and forth and show one map to the left and another map to the right. So this was as difficult to set up as really creating 2 ArcGIS Online maps and then configuring that story map, which took just a minute or 2. So in the next webinar, we'll show you how to do this. And I think it's really pretty impressive that ArcGIS Online lets you do things like this with no coding experience relatively easily. And for the person who asked before, you can actually, instead of having it be 2 separate maps, you could choose one layer of a map that you can swipe on and off if you choose. So we could either set this up as 2 separate maps or have both layers on a single map and choose the swipe to be revealing and hiding one of the layers instead of switching back and forth between maps. Another simple type of story map is something that I put together looking at different sort of features around the university campus, just having pictures that you can click either on the picture or the points in the picture, or navigating throughout the school to show different locations, and if you want to, put text here that describes the story that you would like to tell. Now, this is a relatively simple type of story map, but it's one of the most common ones. And if you look, I used this as an example in the last webinar, but one of the most compelling versions of story maps that I've seen is something this folks at UConn put together for Connecticut's changing landscape, where you can imagine it's almost like you're sitting down behind a book. So for each page of that book, you have the ability to control what's shown over here and what's shown here. And as you flip through the book, it shows information here, whether it's embedded videos, tidbits about size, or interactive maps. So you can see on some pages, you may not have a map at all, and on other pages, you have maps. And this is another example of a story map, instead of the swipe, is something called the magnifying glass, where you can have one type of map or one layer on top that you can move around this looking glass and control the display of the data. So there's lots of different ways once you have your maps in ArcGIS Online that you can use them. You can save them, tweet them, embed them, send a link. You can do presentations. You can create web apps. And again, one of the most compelling of those to me is something called this story map. Now, some of them take very little experience, very little time. You can imagine something like this Connecticut's Changing Landscape took a great deal of time, but the capability is there even without a lot of coding experience. So just to, if anybody has any questions, go ahead. I can still see them as I finish up the last bit here. If you want to get something like ArcGIS Online, if you're interested, remember there's two different options. One's an organizational account. Another one is a public account. The public account is free. Years ago, there was the thought that that public accounts would not be free or would not even be available, but it seems there's been a lot of pushback, and it seems, as far as we can tell, for the foreseeable future, they will be available and be free. If you want an organizational account, it can be very expensive depending on what field you're in, who you are, what you'd like to do with it. But if you want to have more control over privacy, if you want mobile data collection, if you want to have the ability to do analysis online, you probably want to go with an organizational account. Now, depending on who you are, it could be not that expensive. It might even be free. K through 12 schools and informal programs in the United States can apply to the Connect Ed program run through the White House and get an organizational account for free for their school or informal education program. If you're in higher education, it depends on your site license. I know I've gone through recently here at the University of New Hampshire. There are organizational accounts we could use, but I wound up buying our own organizational account within the site license, and it was hundreds of dollars, but not all that expensive for what we got. If you're a nonprofit, there's a program. It depends on what it is that you want to do with it and how many users, but generally speaking, you could get a low-end nonprofit organizational account for $100 a year, and the nonprofit status is determined by Esri. Anybody can get an organizational account for free if you apply to be an Esri developer. Of course, this is not supposed to be used for any operational use. It's supposed to be just for experimentation. And we didn't talk about credits, but credits are used by things like data storage. They're also used up by things like geoprocessing. So the more stuff that requires churning that you do, not really map making, but flexing the true power of the organizational account, uses up credits. And the developer is free, although you only have a certain number of credits per month. But I suggest that this is something people do if they want to try an organizational account and they don't have any other way to do it. Keep in mind, with a developer account, it will be an organization of one. It'll just be you. These other accounts, you can have multiple users. I know for our Cooperative Extension account in New Hampshire, through the UNH site license, we have 100 users on our account. And if you are an ArcGIS for Desktop user, although you may not realize this, you have an organizational license included with your desktop as long as you're on maintenance. So the way things work with Esri is that they want you to pay an annual fee to keep up technical support and keep up with updates. And as long as you've done that, you do have at least one license of ArcGIS Online organizational account to use. So any more specifics than this, feel free to get in touch with them directly. I don't know, and I don't work for or with Esri, but at least I know that this is the basic outline for a lot of the people who are in Extension and or take our workshops when we teach them in person. So back to this series of maps and our webinars and our goal. Really trying to build from using maps online to engage your audience. How do you use ArcGIS Online to create maps and share them? And the next two webinars coming up are much more about story maps. So the starting point is right going into story maps, not any background on ArcGIS Online. Launch right ahead. What are the options? How do you create them? And then on March 7th, how do you use your mobile phone to create story maps on the fly? So if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the text box now or reach out to me directly, either by email, Twitter, phone. You will be getting a link soon with an evaluation. It would be really helpful if people put into there any additional ideas they have, or you could reach out to me by email as well. Different types of content, webinars you'd like to see, topics we touched on which may require additional time or energy.